So let's go into step number 5 already. Monitoring and evaluation. Okay, evaluation refers to the process of just determining the worth or the significance of any activity, any plan, or any program that we develop. Okay, so as a matter of a general approach to this step, we need to think that evaluation is not only a technical process, but as structural change itself. It is definitely political process. Okay, it's the main goal of evaluation is to generate useful knowledge to improve our political context. So it has definitely a political aspect there that we need to take into account. Okay, so what are the key aspects for monitoring and evaluation? The first one, it is important to distinguish between evaluation and monitoring. Okay, although both feedback exercises about the progress that we made, evaluation would be a more in-depth exercise or analysis of our plan, its design, its implementation and results, while the second one, monitoring, would be a kind of a more brief exercise, okay, related to the ongoing management of the plan, right? Then the second one is that it should be embedded in the gender equality plan, okay? Our GEP should include all monitoring and evaluation instruments that we will use and that will support the effective actions and the accountability of the plan. And of course, it will ensure transparency and also promote collective learning, which is one of the main goals of evaluation also. Then the gender expertise is needed and sometimes possibly external. We can ask for external help here, and gender expertise potentially with other expertise on key issues, like, for example, some expertise on change dynamics or some expertise on gender-based violence or sexual harassment, if we're tackling that in our plan, which we should. Things like this, okay? Some specific expertise can be also needed. Then I think that monitoring and evaluation is not something that starts once the GEP is already implemented, but it starts already with a baseline analysis in step 2, okay? So then we need to address, the evaluation should address all the areas of intervention that we identified for our baseline assessment, okay, and that we used to set up our gender equality plan. Then it should establish indicators, targets, and follow-up instruments, and also allocate resources to assess the actions and to enhance the knowledge about the ongoing implementation, okay? However, as sound and as reasonable this might seem, building proper indicators is not always there, okay? And it seems to be quite problematic for some gender equality plans. And sometimes it's even because the institution itself is resistant to this, maybe because they just perceive that, you know, like if they perceive them as a kind of threat if they are not fulfilled or something like that. So we need to change that approach to evaluation, okay? And just approach it as lessons learned. Then we need to acknowledge how the gender equality structures created are a key resource for monitoring and evaluation. Okay, so they can provide insight. They can help us interpreting the results. They can help us identifying new actions or identifying any amendment needed, modifications, and so on. Okay, so work always with them for that. Then, as we were saying, the first thing is that we need to differentiate what is monitoring and what is evaluation. So we will have one slide for each one. So the first one, monitoring, as we just said, is a tool to improve management on a daily basis, okay, to do this daily basis follow-up of the plan and to provide key information for the evaluation that we're going to do later on. So as such, monitoring could be defined as a continuing function that uses systematic collection of data on specified indicators to provide indications of the extent of progress and achievement of objectives and progress in the use of allocated funds. Okay, so monitoring is crucial to enable seeing where and how actions are being implemented. It will help us identifying and addressing potential sources of resistance to change. And it will indicate whether a transformative dynamic already exists or not, if we're already achieving anything or not, okay? So, yeah, that's it. Keep in mind that monitoring does not mean only looking at figures and looking at data, but that other underlying and qualitative aspects also need to be considered in monitoring, okay? And then we have evaluation, which is a more in-depth and thorough analysis, as we said. And the main features of evaluation are, first one, being systematic. So evaluation should systematically collect all the relevant information for answering our evaluation questions. Then it needs to be context sensitive. Okay, there is no single way of evaluation, and each evaluation exercise must be adapted and tailor-made and context sensitive, okay? Evaluators need to pay attention to all the different structural and contextual elements and to the organizational culture of our institution, and of course be as flexible as possible during the whole evaluation process, okay? Then timeliness. It is important for evaluation to take a time frame also into account and to set milestones, and time limits throughout the evaluation process, okay? This will contribute to, of course, to the organizational learning, but it will also facilitate the decision-making if there is changes, amendments needed or anything. It will facilitate that, okay? Although we know that transforming the organizational cultures, of course, takes time, but yeah, we need to set these time frames, okay? And the evaluation should also pay attention not only to short-term measures, but also to the long-term ones. So we need to think, how are we going to evaluate the impact of those? Then evaluation should focus on what is done, okay? It should focus on the analysis of the plan, of the policies and of the actions that we have already implemented. And we can also look at if at some point we have not been able to implement anything, then we need to think why it's not implemented, but we need to focus on what is done, okay? And why what's not done, why it is not done. And last, evaluation paves the way for future actions, okay? It offers valuable knowledge for the designing of our future actions, okay? Normally, if we're working already in our second or in our third gender equality plan, which might be the case in your institution, you should have included the evaluation of the first, of the previous gender equality plan for the second one, okay? And here you have this, the evaluation is also a step-by-step process within our wider step-by-step institutional change process. So you can see all the different steps of the evaluation plan here in this graphic I brought here. We don't have the time in this training to go deeper into each step of the evaluation process, but I have left the reference. I recommend you to check the guidelines for evaluating gender equality plans that you will find at the end of the presentation, okay? If you want to go a little bit deeper into each one of the steps of, for an evaluation, okay? Sorry for not being able to go into everything. Then, within our evaluation process, we gather all data, we analyze them, and then we elaborate the evaluation report, which should include all these, the indicators and the assessment of the progress made, the identification of remaining inequalities, and recommendations for the next planning round, okay? That is the most important. And here in the drawing, what you can see is that we have different types of evaluation depending on the moment it is conducted, okay? Then indicators. I brought these because some of you were especially interested in indicators. Monitoring and evaluation are based on indicators, okay? These are really important. And in the end, it's just a measure. It's a number or a fact, an opinion, a perception that will just help to point out the situation and will measure change in that situation over time, okay? So specifically, our indicators should first help you identify whether your work is making a difference or not. They should describe observable changes or events which relate to the project implementation. They should provide the evidence that something has actually happened. And when designing them, we need to be clear on what you want to measure, okay, to assess progress. And your indicators should be used throughout the whole process. Okay, we can set up two kinds of indicators. We can set up quantitative and qualitative indicators. The first one are measures of quantity that should be adapted to the expected results, okay? And they are expressed in numbers or in rates, in frequencies, percentages, and statistical average and things like that, okay? Some examples, it's like percentage of staff trained in gender equality, or the number of female and male candidates for a position, things like that, okay? And so we can go through the examples, but you've got also lots of examples in the gear tool, so just go and check that. And then we have qualitative indicators that will provide a more in-depth understanding of the problem, and this will include people's judgment or people's perception of the subject that we want to measure, okay? So they focus on the experiences of people, so they're really important for us. And the basic dimensions here that can be considered when we define our qualitative indicators are, first, the mainstreaming of gender knowledge and the awareness among the different categories of staff, including researchers. Then the uptake of the gender equality objectives set by our gender equality plan within the institution, okay? So whether they are owning the gender equality objectives or not. And then the actual transformation of both informal and formal practices in the different key areas, okay? The practices transformation. So these indicators can really contribute to a better understanding of our process, okay? And think that sometimes they can be really easily set up. We think that they're like more complex, but sometimes no. Sometimes they can be answered even with a yes or no question. Like, for instance, knowing if whatever gender equality structure is set up, or if it's mandated, it's endorsed by the top of the organization or not. This is a yes or no question and is a qualitative indicator also, okay? And just a practical tip, when we choose our indicators, we need to keep focus and differentiate what we want to know and what we need to know, okay? So just make the question before defining them. And a practical tip also, use indicators that are relatively easy to collect, okay? And then last, remember, as we were saying, your indicators need to be smart.